Greetings everyone. Welcome to the lecture on Making of National Movement 1870 to 1947. We have already discussed different phases of national movement as they evolved from 1850s, 1860s onwards, and how after the Second World War the stage was set for a more active phase, which came in the form of Quit India movement. It was a civil disobedience movement that had been launched in India in August 1942 in response to Gandhi's call for immediate independence. The All India Congress Committee proclaimed a mass protest demanding what Gandhi called an orderly British withdrawal from India. The call for determined but passive resistance appears in his call to do or die. This famous call was issued on 9th August at the Gowaliya Tank Maidan in Mumbai in 1942. Hubli, which is a major city in the state of Karnataka. Here he said, "I want freedom immediately this very night. Before dawn, if it can be had. Congress must win freedom or be wiped out in the effort. We shall either free India or die in the attempt." So here again you see the emphasis was on dying to win freedom and to put the best possible efforts to show that the continuation of British rule was no longer to be tolerated. If we talk about the Quit India campaign, then by the end of World War II, Britain saw that it could still control India, but only by using force. And against this, Mahatma Gandhi began his Satyagraha campaign, in which he proclaimed that there should be mass civil disobedience across in India in order to wipe out the British rule. And so the entire narrative was on mobilizing the masses, and the movement was not to be limited only to the leaders. Now, what was the reaction of the colonial regime? The British responded with severe repression, and by the end of 1943, over 90,000 people had been arrested and around 1,000 had been killed in police firing. So Mahatma Gandhi decided to begin a new phase of movement, and several other leaders, once they were arrested, the peasants and youths continued to participate in the movement in large numbers. Symbols of state authority were attacked all over the country, telephone lines were cut off, and in several areas people set up their own governments, which kind of emerged as a parallel government. As you can see in this visual, this movement was definitely on a much larger scale as compared to earlier movements. It appeared as if the entire country had come out and they were participating in the marches and in their opposition to the British rule. However, the movement also was going to bring about some other disturbing factors, and these were independence but with partition. As you can see, the mass exodus which began as a result of partition, with both the communities leaving their homes and going to opposite directions. Talking about the Quit India campaign, this was a time when post-World War, there was a hope that something positive would come, but the entire city of Hubli was filled with people participating in the Quit India movement, and several placards, posters, etc. could be seen everywhere. So thousands of people gathered, and the scene was found in several other cities also. And during the course of the movement, Mahatma Gandhi and several other leaders were arrested by British government under the Defence of India rules. The Congress Working Committee, the All India Congress Committee and the 4 provincial Congress committees were declared unlawful associations under the Criminal Law Amendment Act. And the assembly of public meetings was also prohibited under Rule 56 of the Defence of India Rules. The arrest of Gandhi and the Congress leaders led to mass demonstrations throughout India, in which thousands were killed and still they were not budging. It was not only this, there were strikes that were called in several places, and the British suppressed many of these demonstrations through mass detentions, and more than 1 lakh people were imprisoned and also tortured. So what was the end result of Quit India movement? One important result was that it united the Indian people against colonial rule. Although most of the demonstrations had been suppressed by 1944, upon his release in 1944, Gandhi continued his resistance and went on a 21-day fast. And the very next day, Gandhi, Nehru and other top leaders of INC, they had to devise a strategy. The INC had been declared illegal and all its funds had been frozen. The INC offices had been raided and the documents had been seized. And this further created an uproar all over India and there were demonstrations. Many of these demonstrations also turned into riots and violence. The key targets were police offices, railway lines, communication posts, government buildings, and as a result of so much of disorder, there was slowing down of the supplies reaching the British Army who were fighting the Japanese in Burma. There were riots at several places, and to restore the order, British had to divert 35,000 troops to support the police. The campaign gradually began to die off by November, and by the end of year, it was clear that it had petered out. Meanwhile, by the end of Second World War, Britain's place in the world had changed dramatically, and the demand for independence could no longer be ignored. So in this visual, as you can see, the British officials were forced to meet with Congress leaders and to devise strategy. In the meanwhile, there also was a very important development that was going on, and that was the demand for separate nation. In 1940, the Muslim League had moved a resolution to demand independent states for the Muslims in the northwestern as well as eastern areas of the country, because these were projected as Muslim majority areas. In fact, from late 1930s onwards, the League had begun to visualize the Muslims as a separate nation from the Hindus, and the famous slogan that was raised by was "Ladke Lenge Pakistan." So there was a widening of differences that continued between the League and the Congress, and the results of the provincial elections of 1937 further convinced the League that Muslims were not going to be treated fairly if they do not ask for a separate system altogether. The League started fearing or started playing upon the fear that the Muslims would have to play a second fiddle in any kind of independent democratic structure that would prevail after the end of the colonial rule. And the Congress continued to reject to form a joint Congress League government in the United Provinces in 1937, which greatly annoyed the League. That talks between the Congress and the League failed because League projected itself as one of the spokesperson of Indian Muslims, whereas the Congress had a huge support from Muslims also. Congress was a secular party which never kind of decided its fate on the basis of religious identity. So elections to the provinces that were held again in 1946, and the result showed that while the Congress performed in general constituencies, the League succeeded on Muslim seats. This was also a time of a very important development, that was cabinet mission. It was in March 1946 that a 3-member cabinet mission was sent to Delhi to examine the demand of independence, and it suggested a suitable framework for independent India. The cabinet mission suggested a loose confederation with some autonomy for Muslim majority areas, but the Congress and the Muslim League could not agree to specific details of the proposal. So this proposal also failed to materialize, and after the failure of cabinet mission, the Muslim League decided on mass agitation for winning its Pakistan demand. It announced 16th August 1946 as Direct Action Day, and this was also a time when riots broke out in Calcutta, and they lasted for several days, in which thousands of people were killed, and the same violence spread to different parts of North India by March 1947, and eventually partition became a reality, and the two nations, India and Pakistan, were born. Now also let us look at what was the reaction of other leaders and how much they were in favor of partition. So we can talk about leaders like Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan, who was famously known as Badshah Khan. He was a Pashtun leader from northwestern frontier province, and he had been a founder of Khudai Khidmat Gars, which was a non-violent movement, and it opposed partition, and he also criticized Congress for agreeing on the proposal of partition. Then we can also talk about Maulana Azad, who was a great scholar of Islam, and he was also an exponent of Wahadat-e-Deen, which essentially meant the oneness of all religions, whether it was Hindu religion or Muslim religion or any religion. His idea was that all of them are originating from the same source, and so therefore he opposed Jinnah's two-nation theory. Then the leaders like C. Rajgopalachari, who was a member of interim government in 1946 and the Governor General of Free India, also was of different opinion. Sardar Patel, who also led the freedom movement, and he had been the president of INC in 1931, was against this move. The same can be said of Jawaharlal Nehru also in the beginning. However, later on, when the conditions became such that partition eventually had to be accepted, and it was finally accepted. So, with these kind of developments taking place and different opinions emerging, how do we describe the situation? The situation can be described as completely out of hand. As you can see in this visual, the streets were filled with violence, and it was not limited to a particular community only, and especially the period from 1946 to 1947 was marked by this violent phase. So this Hindu-Muslim conflict that was being projected, and that too at a time when Mahatma Gandhi was preaching about tolerance, about non-violence. So it clearly emerges like a dichotomy. Unfortunately, fear and tension refused to exit, and the Muslim leaders feared oppression from the majority community, and they kept on working to create the new separate state of Pakistan. There were members of both the communities who had cooperated and who had lost their lives fighting for the national movement. The Muslim League led by Muhammad Ali Jinnah asked for a separate state, and refused to compromise. The religious differences were projected as also being important and also being associated with the political and economic differences, and all this was imaginary, but it was proclaimed as real and it began appearing as real. So the situation was not changing, and while Mahatma Gandhi had been initially of the opinion that different groups could live together if they respected each other, each other's beliefs, but this distrust refused to die down, and the economic differences among the different communities further fueled the fire. So the political, economic, social, religious differences all fell into the place. And ultimately, Mahatma Gandhi had to admit and he had to accept the proposal of partition, and along with India's independence came the partition of the country into two separate states. However, Gandhi did not take part in the celebration of India's independence because of the tragedy that had been unfolding. As you can see in this map, overnight the map of India had changed. So now there was Pakistan towards the northwestern portion of India, and towards the east was the state of Bangladesh. Now, what was East Pakistan, which later on became Bangladesh? Now, if we talk about the violence that was emerging, a major form of violence was riots. There were killings, there were murders, there were rapes, and finally in 1947 the British Parliament tried to prevent this civil war by passing the Indian Independence Act. This act ultimately partitioned the Indian subcontinent into two independent nations, in which Pakistan came to be ruled by Jinnah, while India came to be ruled by Nehru. So this entire change that had happened, one cannot say that this was the result of developments that took place in 1940 or 1942 or 1944, because these developments had started from late 19th century itself, when there was hardening of community identities. So both the communities had started believing that they probably belonged to different ideas, they had different set of practices, and they needed to promote that in order to become successful in political struggle against the British. And both the governments on each side after independence, though they stressed a policy of religious toleration, however the mutual distrust continued, and as a result of partition more than 5 lakh people had perished and a number of families were destroyed, and more than 15 million people had migrated to their religious majority country. So it is still unbelievable as to how all this happened, and one needs to go back into history, one needs to go back into the entire 19th century onwards as to what were the developments that took place, that this kind of a situation appeared during mid 20th century in India. And ultimately Mahatma Gandhi's end also came as a result of the assassination, because he was considered to be as one of the responsible persons for bringing about this partition, which of course was not true. And one has to go through the entire scheme of events that were unfolding. And while independence from British was a joyous occasion, but it was marred by violence. The riots continued for a long time, and the result was not very pleasing. And ultimately, Mahatma Gandhi's assassination proved that non-violence could only bring about destruction. Here I would like to quote a few lines from Mahatma Gandhi. My true test of non-violence will come when I am shot by an assassin and I am able to die without holding any malice towards my assassin. So basically, Mahatma Gandhi died with this idea that he had no grudge against the person who had killed him, who had displayed violence, and very peacefully he had already kind of made up his mind that what is true non-violence is this only, that in your thoughts and in your mind you continue to remain non-violent come what may. Thank you.